And welcome to the beginning of our coverage here at the Open Networking Summit 2017. We're here with Martin Casado talking about the future of the network. And Martin, welcome.
Hey, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, thanks for being here. It's been a couple years since the last time we spoke. We talked about the future of the network back then. We're going to talk about it again, another iteration this time.
Great.
I want to talk about something that either was said by you or maybe one of your colleagues at Andreessen Horowitz about the renaissance of the future of the network. Are we in another, again, iteration of that?
I think so. And but it requires us to think a little bit differently about what it means to be a network. And so I like to define a network by the endpoints, right? So in the early days, it was a computer. And then things evolved, so it became, for example, the virtual machine or the container. And now we're seeing the rise of microservices. So a microservice is like a function, like a programmatic function that holds, some sort of value behind it. And then other programs use that function. So for example, Twilio you could say is a microservice where you can call a function and do SMS. And so I think that the new renaissance of networking is now you have microservices, and those are the endpoints, and now we need to rebuild network infrastructure to connect all those microservices. And because it's at a higher level and they have kind of different behavior, we need different network infrastructure. Like we want, session level of awareness, we want new types of discovery and so forth. And so it's kind of like another opportunity for the networking industry to reinvent itself.
Now, during your keynote here at ONS 2017, just about 20 minutes ago, you talked about the relationship between software and hardware, also the transition from hardware to software. Everyone has a different perspective about that transition and the impact on their business. Consumers have a perspective,
right.
Infrastructure guys as well, and enterprise. Can you sort of go over that?
Yeah, sure. And I always found at least, when I was very active in this in the mid 2000s when we just started out, I always found actually the consumer companies, the consumer tech companies, the Googles, the Facebooks, and the Amazons were almost like, crystal balls on what the future would look like. So these are some of the fastest growing, most successful companies on the planet. And if you look at how they built their data centers, they decided to use general purpose hardware and then to put functionality in software and run that software on top. And that was kind of the approach they decided to take. And they were catering to kind of the consumer market. And the enterprise had used the traditional model. And so what we've seen over time is the enterprise start to adopt that kind of consumer model, or from the consumer company model, but in a way that makes sense to the enterprise with enterprise level features. So the architecture is now, as we're seeing adopted in the enterprise, general purpose hardware and software, but that software looks different and it does cater to these enterprise features. So I think that we're seeing a disruption kind of across the standard industry verticals. And by the way, this also includes telco as well. So I would say, traditional enterprise, telco, and consumer companies all are seeing this software revolution.
Now the software disruption, I sort of divided it up into three categories, and you touched on it just a bit just now, but compute, storage, and security. Again, can you go through that cross-section for us?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think that, like I said before, infrastructure is moving up a layer to the infrastructure layer. So the traditional abstractions have been IP addresses, blocks, ACLs, very low-level primitives have been how we've built things in the past. But now, in the time of microservices, we can reimagine these services as high-level abstractions. So instead of a block storage, maybe like an object in a program. Instead of an IP address, maybe a function, a remote function that we call. Instead of an ACL, maybe some language-specific security feature. And so I think all of these are being transformed into higher level abstractions because we are moving into this microservices realm.
Now I want to ask you about the developer stake in driving a new way to go to market. You talked about this in depth in a recent podcast, again, on the Andreessen Horowitz website, if anyone wants to go to that. Really, these developers upsetting the traditional process of going to market.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. If you look at traditionally in the enterprise buying center, the traditional vendors, the Ciscos, the Oracles, the IBMs, the HPs, they basically owned the go-to-market motion. They had the relationship with the customer that went back decades. They owned the channel. They had relationships with the analysts. They have all the certifications and everything else. That was, so from the perspective of a startup, one of the most difficult things to do was to take a product and actually bring it to the customer because the incumbents were so powerful there. But what's happening is the buying center is shifting from core IT which used to buy all of the infrastructures, to developers, which have actually more and more buying power. And developers procure very different than core IT procures. So developers procure, like they were trained by Amazon, so they like to like basically swipe a credit card and get something. They don't have analyst relationships. They often don't buy through the channel and so forth. So we're seeing this big disruption in who's buying. They have a different buying behavior. So a lot of this kind of entrenched legacy moat is being disrupted. I think it's actually one of the most significant movements in the industry.
So Martin, the traffic that typically comes through your venture capital firm, are they aware of this challenge of going to market, or are you enlightening them to that?
You know, I feel like I'm seeing the maturation of thinking around this in real time. I mean, it used to be the case that people thought you needed to do traditional enterprise sales, or they thought open source software would sell itself, and neither is true. The reality is that you can use open source to get access to the developer, but you almost have to treat that as top of funnel. Like that's basically how you get the first intro to the account, but then you still have to build a sales force to then go ahead and sell the deal. And like, I think it's over the last year that this has really started to be understood. So like you said, I've done podcasts on this, I've written blogs on this, and I've done talks, and we're starting to see more and more startups coming in that actually understand this fundamentally, but I think we're still early in the general shift around this.
Martin, really quickly before we wrap, the founders of ONF, the Open Networking Foundation, were former partners of yours at Nicira, and if that's correct, how has this sort of evolved, what we're seeing around us here over the last 5-6 years?
Yeah, so you know, ONF, so the founders of ONF, Nick and Scott, were partners at Nicira, and they always were focused on the general industry movement about that. And what's really been nice for me is just to see such a solid maturation from something that was actually pretty lofty and academic at a point in time to eventually becoming like something that was like core industry. If you look at the representation here, I mean, you've got a great cross-section of industry from startups to vendors to telcos. You've got real products in the space. I think you have real conversations that are happening. And so I think the biggest change is not necessarily in content, not necessarily in focus, but really in the maturation of an industry from kind of a lofty ideal to, you know, this is a real industry that's being represented here. So it's very exciting.
Martin, it's great to have you here and great to see you again here at ONS.
Yeah, you too, man.
Yeah,
all right. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. And for all of our coverage here at ONS 2017, you can go to tinow.org. So long.